Hey guys, and welcome back to another video from Build Order Win. My name is The Truth, and today we're going to be looking at a Protoss versus Protoss introduction. What I mean by that, of course, is just an introduction to the matchup. And the reason I wanted to make this video is so that when you watch my future Protoss versus Protoss build orders, this will give you a better understanding of sort of why I'm doing what I'm doing in those builds and why it makes sense. And yeah, hopefully we can just go over the PvP matchup as a whole as well. You know, sort of regardless if you choose to try out some of my build orders or even watch those videos. So anyway, let's just get started right away. I'm going to sort of follow a similar model to the other two intro videos. And so to start off, we're just going to talk about some of the early game in PvP and just sort of the matchup just in general. And so, Protoss vs. Protoss is definitely a pretty weird matchup because in Wings of Liberty, I guess we're going back to Wings of Liberty, there was, you know, it started off especially with a lot of smaller maps, a lot of sort of more all NE play, 2-base play. You know, going to 3 bases was sort of like considered the late game, I would say. But now the meta in StarCraft 2 Heart of the Storm is we see a lot of bigger maps, we see a lot of much more refined build orders, and because of that, we have third base is becoming just part of the game. Like Protoss vs. Terran, you expect to see the Protoss player take a third base. In PvP, that's not the case, but okay, so I was trying to bring it back to PvP. But yeah, what I'm trying to say is, like, most matchups right now, you know, to get into the late game, you have to first take a third base, I guess. First take a third base. But in PvP, you know, there's a lot of all-ins that are still viable on 1 base, on 2 base, and because of that, it's it can be difficult to get into a macro game, even if you're trying to just play defensive and take a third base and whatnot. So anyway, so that's sort of the gist I just wanted to start off with, is that there's a lot of early shenanigans that can work and can do at least good harassment damage, and I think this matchup is unique because, you know, before in Wings of Liberty it used to be, there was a saying that the first player to take a Nexus, to take a expansion, meaning they're natural, would be the player that loses. Now that's not really the case, but it still can be for sure, because there are a lot of viable all-ins, as I've been saying. So yeah, first thing in PvP, you definitely want to have a plan to make sure you're safe versus proxy, or versus cheese just in general. There's 2 ways I would recommend going about that. Once again, I sort of mentioned this in other videos as well, but I will be doing a scouting information video, most likely, on this matchup, and so we'll talk more in depth about that in the future. But yeah, you want your build order to be able to cover you versus cheese, so whether it's you make early units or you scout thoroughly, one of the 2 are definitely recommended. And then in PvP, it's good to open with typically 1 tech option, so Stargate or Twilight Council, and then you make a robo, and then you expand. Or you can expand between the tech option and the robo. So that's, I think, typically how most games will open up. Of course, this isn't the only way to play, and of course you can also do robo expands, but they're generally a bit weaker of the 3 tech paths, which would be Twilight Council, Robo, and Stargate. Going into an expansion, though, and doing some pressure stuff. Is this guy stuck? I don't think so. Let's see, where am I going with this? So, typically, 1 base PvP stuff, it sort of, like, falls off really quickly in terms of viability. So if you want to do, like, an all-in, like I'm trying to do this game, the more time your opponent has to react, especially when they have a second base and they have more economy coming in for income, just the more time they have to defend, the more likely they are to defend successfully, for sure. So it's good to know when to transition in PvP. If you are the defender, you need to know when you can step out and take an expansion safely. Let's see, I'm getting a little bit distracted by this game, but let's just speed this up. Because I really wanted to get into the mid-game of Protoss versus Protoss. Actually, I guess we can talk about the sort of what your build order should accomplish in the early game off of one base. So some of the more popular build orders are Blink, there's Oracle openings, Phoenix openings, 3-gate pressure, which is essentially like a 4-gate where you just warp in a lot of stalkers, but you have 2 gases, so you can take a tech behind it. And you have more workers as well. So it's a bit slower, of course. But there's a lot of different builds, like DT expand, and they sort of all accomplish the same thing, which is, even if this doesn't do significant harassment damage, I can at least know what my opponent is doing by moving across the map. Even Robo expands. Usually you'll open up with a sentry, and so you can use that for hallucinated Phoenix scouting. And so that's sort of like the foundation of a good build, like a solid build. There are builds that for sure are not as safe, but will still be good. But if you want a solid build, typically it involves with at least you get to know what your opponent is doing, and so that way you don't die to either an all-in or something like Proxy Dark Templar and whatnot. Going into the mid-game for PvP, once again, you know, it used to be whoever expands first is usually the person that loses. In the Heart of the Swarm meta, that's not really the case anymore, but it still can be. But being able to scout for when your opponent is expanding is very important, because if they do open up with some sort of pressure, and they've expanded way before you think they have, then that will sort of cost you the game right away. They're just right there, because you'll be too far behind on economy. But typically after you take an expansion in Protoss vs. Protoss, you want to get the Robo. And the reason is because primarily it's for detection, I think, but also Immortals are really good, and then you're either going to go for Colossus in the mid-game, or you're going to go for Immortals and Archons and Charge Lots. So either way, you need the Robo. And then don't get too greedy after you've taken a Nexus, because there are plenty of 2-base all-ins, even if your opponent has taken a Nexus. But once you do feel safe, it's typically a good idea to get the Forge. As soon as you feel safe on 2 bases, you want the Forge, so you can start getting attack upgrades, and only attack upgrades. You can get armor after you get +3 attack. But I would say like the 3 most important things in this matchup, when we're talking about having a good late game, is number 1, to sort of have the macro lead, so expand before your opponent. That's obviously going to be very helpful in a mirror matchup. Number 2 is to have the better composition, and so part of this is starting Colossus before your opponent, or adding a second Robo to get ahead in the Colossus count. Also having, you know, no stalkers in your late game composition, that sort of stuff. But then the third big thing is to have an attack upgrade lead on your opponent. Now my opponent is just starting +2, and mine is as well just starting. This will usually be the case, I think, in the at least higher level games, as players sort of generally know when to start the Forge. And so, you know, if I use a couple more Chrono Boosts, maybe I can hit a slim +3 advantage timing on my opponent, but it's not going to be very likely. So in the mid game though, first thing, you want to make sure you aren't going to die to an all-in. As soon as you feel comfortable in the fact that you won't, I actually want to back this replay up a little bit. But the idea is you essentially are doing 3 core things. If you want to play just a standard macro game, you're doing 3 core things at this point. Number 1 is building up your sort of more expensive units, your non-gateway units, I suppose. So if you're doing Immortal Archon, you want to be constantly making Immortals. If you're doing Colossus, you want to be making Colossus. The next thing you're doing is obviously making workers as well, until you can saturate your 2 bases, and then once you take a 3rd base, you can make it a few more workers. And then the next thing is getting your attack upgrades. Those are the 3 things you're doing. I'm leaving the production tab up right now, just to show you that I'm not warping in any units off of my gateways, which I do have 3 right now. And my opponent is most likely doing the same. So he's made these Stalkers to defend versus the Phoenix, but he's not going to make any more gateway units until, basically until after he's taken a third base. And it just, doing so really slows down your macro. It makes you, will make you safer versus all-ins, and that's why it's good to identify when an all-in can come and when it can't come. But okay, so going into the late game, in this matchup is again pretty weird. It isn't similar to other matchups in that your worker count in the late game is not that important. So it's okay to have 60, 65 workers, I would say. But in the sort of, once you're maxed out, it's almost better to have like 50 workers. And the reason is because, as I'm sure many of you know, in PvP, it's not really about remaxing after a big battle occurs. It's more so about just having more stuff in that big battle, and then, you know, you expect one person or the other to sort of just win decisively. And so having a lot of gateways and a strong economy isn't going to help you much if you can't have the same army size as your opponent for that first initial fight. So the reason why this makes it sort of a weird situation is because you can do really good late game harassment, and I've been in this situation a number of times where I've lost a lot of workers in the late game, but then I just replace that supply with more army, and then I go kill my opponent because he has much less army supply than me. So if we look at the workers count, I'm at 58, he's at 62. You could even say this is a bit too many for me, or I guess that's fine. I'm not going to give you like an exact number, but you can for sure see you don't need 62 workers right now. He's got 16 on his natural, which is good, and then he's got 26 here. I think he's taking a fourth base because he knows he should spread out his workers, get more gas income since he has them anyway. The other option would to honestly just be sacrifice some of these workers to get a bigger army. So, anyway, I guess the last point I'm going to make on PvP is that typically the way this matchup goes is there will be a lot of shenanigans in the early game. There will be some two-base all-ins that can occur in the mid-game, and then you can even do attacks to deny your opponent's third base, and then get your third base as you're doing that attack. But the time between that and this scenario we're seeing right here is essentially just both players building up an army as fast as they can and making it as strong as they can. And then the unit positioning is extremely important in this fight, in these late game fights, and then also the attack upgrades are extremely important in these fights as well. And then I guess the last thing is having a close warp-in point is very helpful as well. Right now mine is here, and obviously that's much further away than his, so that was a big mistake. But okay, I guess this was pretty good timing because the game is over, and I feel like I covered hopefully sort of a good all-around feel for the matchup. But yeah, so when we look at my build orders in the future, I will sort of talk about why I'm doing stuff, and then if you've watched this video or if you already know a lot about PvP, it'll sort of make sense, hopefully. That's the goal. We'll see what happens. But yeah, I think that's going to be it for this. I might come back and make a few more edits, but for now, thanks for watching. And yeah, hope you guys come back for some more stuff.